So again, if you were born before the year 1982 and the first person to raise their hand to answer this question, you'll get a signed copy of my book link. This is a really good prize, let me tell you. So here's the question.
John, let me do one last thing.
Oh.
Tap on it first. Thank you.
Aha. And where we go. There's the question. Where were you on January 28th, 1986, and what happened on that date? First hand, oh, way in the back. What's your name? Brian gets the book. If you didn't hear Brian, good job. So if you didn't hear Brian, it was that fateful morning on Tuesday, January 28th at Cape Canaveral when this nation lost. Come on. Hey. Ah, we got a technical. Oh, no. One finger. There we go. Our nation.
I'll be your Vanavite. How about that?
Our nation lost these 7 brave men and women, one of which was Christine McCullough, the first teacher in space, actually the first civilian in space, and thousands of people had applied to go on that mission. Now, there was a lengthy investigation that followed, and we all know what happened. The O-rings failed. You see, the temperature on that particular launch day was around 31 degrees. The previous coldest launch was 52. And those O-rings that were on the solid rocket boosters, there was concern they might shrink in those cold temperatures. But what many people don't know is about a meeting that took place 2 days before the 28th on the 26th, while the Challenger was sitting on the pad. And that meeting was facilitated by engineers from Morton Thiokol. They were the manufacturers of those solid rocket boosters. You see, in previous launches, the space shuttle would get to a certain altitude. The SRBs would fall off. They would land in the ocean. They would get recovered. And then they would look at those O-ring joints and survey the damage. And so true to form, and I'm going to call this Business 1.0 back in the day, they called a meeting in Cape Canaveral, engineers from Thiokol, engineers from NASA, and NASA management, to present some data about previous O-ring damage. And they fired up the tool they had at the time, a Kodak 4400 carousel slide projector, just like this one. It's really not much different than what I call Business 2.0 today with Keynote and Prysm and PowerPoint. They were just doing this, click, click, click. And here's what they clicked. These are the actual images from January 26th, 1986. What you're seeing are icons with some metadata on them. 2 pieces of metadata, temperature, and a damage index number. And one by one, they click these by. 33 of them, in fact. And after the conclusion of the meeting, where all this data was reviewed, the chief engineer at NASA did the following. Walked over to a red rotary telephone, just like this one. Mission Control. We have thoroughly examined the data that Morton Thiokol has presented from the previous launches. We have no reason to believe that there is going to be any issue with the O-ring joints for the launch schedule for the 28th. Resume the countdown clock. Decision made. And we all know it was not a good decision. In the investigation that NASA did, they decided we need some help. And so they hired this man, Edward Tufte. Edward Tufte is the world's leading authority on the presentation of data and how it should be done. He's a professor at Yale. I met him in 2008. He's written a lot of books like this, on visual explanations of data. There is a way the brain best takes data in and makes decisions with it. And this man understood that in the 80s. So what he did, he took all those slides that were clicked on by and put them into one spatially oriented mosaic, much like what Prysm does. And this is what he did. This is what he got. A simple scatter plot, or box plot, depending on how you want to describe it, with an extrapolation curve based on the temperature that was predicted on the 28th, and anyone would have looked at this and said, don't launch the shuttle. It's a 100% failure rate. There was nothing wrong with the data at all. Now, what we have found in our advances in neuroscience since that time is this. Decision-making is hampered when data is presented sequentially. We just don't work that well with this. And so we call this Business 1.0, the old slide projector. Remember when you put the slides in upside down? I did that a few times back in the day. And the rotary phone, it took a while to make the call. But Business 2.0 isn't much different, isn't it? You come into a room, you sit down, and instead it's Keystone, it's Prezi, it's PowerPoint, and they're just clicking through. And most people are, they're thumbing on their device, or they're tapping on a laptop. They're not engaged. And so we need to change that and get out of the 1.0, 2.0 rabbit hole and get to 3.0, where we leverage what neuroscience has taught us, and I'm going to jump into that in a minute. Now, I want to digress for a moment and talk about this guy. Dan Ariely is one of my favorite authors. In fact, the book that he wrote recently is probably, in my opinion, the best book I have read in 10 years. And it's called The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. He's a professor at MIT Sloan School of Business. He's a best-selling author. He's a TED speaker. But his books are a riot. You'll be laughing as you're learning, which is really the best way to learn. So anyway, Dan Ariely, in his book on dishonesty, like 20 years of research into this. And here's an example. If you buy the fake Gucci sunglasses and the fake Prada shoes, like 20 bucks, 30 bucks, and then show your friends, look what I got, you're more apt to do dishonest things than people who buy the real McCoy and spend the hard-earned money for the real Prada shoes and Gucci sunglasses. So that's an example of dishonesty. So in the spirit of Dan Ariely, I am not a paid pitchman for Prysm at all. And the reason is I came here a year ago, I met Matt Proctor, I saw this technology, and I said, this is what I wrote about 4 years ago. This is what the neuroscience have been screaming for 20 years, that our brain does not take in data well sequentially. We don't make good decisions that way. If you ever have an event, I'll come and speak. Let me know. And that's what happened, and that's why I'm here. And so now I want to give you a little bit of insight into the neuroscience side of this, because there's lots of data there. So we're going to go back in time again, but not as far. So more people in the room are now alive. It's 1994. Now, remember 1994. Bill Clinton was president. So if Hillary wins in November, we're going to have Mr. President and Mr. President. He cannot be first man. Sorry. So that's going to be interesting. Let's see. Boys to Men was the #1 group. I'll pass on that. I'm more of a Coldplay guy. And in astronomy, you might remember this. Shoemaker-Levy comet plowed into Jupiter, and we saw it happen. Now you might think, so what? Comet plowed into Jupiter. Guess what? If Shoemaker-Levy had plowed into Earth, the only life that would have survived are deep-sea amphibians. So be thankful that Jupiter's gravitational pull took care of the problem. But something else happened in 1994, very analogous to the discovery of DNA to biology, which has been my career for 27 years. In a small town called Parma, Italy, which is in north-central Italy, 2 neuroscientists were working with one of these, a macaque monkey. Now, macaques are interesting primates because their brain is very, very close to that of a human. It's like 99.99999%. And they were working with this primate, and they weren't harming him in any way. He had a device on his head that was measuring neuron activity. So here's how the experiment went. Marco Iacoboni's manipulating a peanuts in front of the monkey, but the monkey's doing this. I'm not buying the monkey see, monkey do. This is not for me, sorry. Galici's on the computer monitor scratching his head. Why? He's seeing neuron activity firing in the frontal lobe of the primate's brain that would fire if it was actually doing the motor response. And Iacoboni's is still manipulating the peanuts, and the monkey's not doing a thing. They tried this experiment over and over. The primate was like, hey, buddy, not for me today. Why didn't you bring a banana? I'm a monkey. I'm not an elephant. Peanuts, get it? But the point is they realized they discovered something. And a lot of experiments that followed showed they discovered mirror neurons in the frontal lobe of the brain of primates and in humans. Why is this significant? Well, the mirror neuron acts like a primer. So the monkey's brain, these neurons that were firing as if it was manipulating the peanuts. But it wasn't. But that sets the brain up to do the actual motor response. So think about this in a collaborative environment. When we observe others, it's changing what our brain is actually doing. Now, when you think of Business 2.0, with everyone sitting around a table, oh, get the meeting minutes out, oh, get the PowerPoint deck with 100 slides, my neck's going to be like sore in about an hour and a half. No one's looking at each other. We wonder why we don't make good decisions. So here's an example just from neuroscience of the mirror neuron system. We're not leveraging it at all. We have a lot to learn from the macaque monkey. Then there's another guy I'd like you to meet. He lives fairly close by. Dr. Paul Ekman. He lives in San Francisco. This guy has spent 55 years doing pretty much one thing. Imagine that, spending half a century doing one thing, studying the human face. He's codified every single facial expression known. And he puts it into a framework called FACS, Facial Action Coding System. It's used by the CIA. It's used by HR groups to help them determine how someone's actually thinking and what they are they being truthful, that sort of thing, by their facial expressions. And he's identified all these things down to the minutia level. Why is that important? Well, it's important because when we want to build an innovative culture in our organizations, we need to be face-to-face, not tethered to an electronic leash. And what Ekman has shown in his research, if I walk into a room and I sit in front of you and smile, your brain will actually function better. And then if you're smiling, he starts smiling, and we're working on a project, we're more apt to get a better solution. If we turn in unison and interact with data in a spatial way, come back together face-to-face, go back to the data, interact spatially, not sequentially, you've got an advantage over your competitor big time, from a neuroscience standpoint, from a behavior science standpoint. And that's just 2 scientists of dozens and dozens that I wrote about in my book. It's out there. And the human brain's somewhat of an interesting thing in itself. Did you know your brain is just 2% of your body weight? 2%, but uses 30% of your caloric intake. But the brain also has a kind of a bad side to it. It reaches maturity at age 25, and you start shedding 90,000 brain cells per day, roughly, after 25. That's kind of a downer. But you can actually reduce that rate of destruction of brain cells by doing a few things. Every pound you lose will actually slow down the destruction of brain cells. Sleeping 7 hours minimum will slow down that destruction, as will a healthy diet. But there's a couple other things you can do. You read something, learn something, you'll actually slow down that rate. And when you have face-to-face discussions with people, solving problems or trying to reach rapport, you will slow down the destruction of brain cells. Imagine that. Getting out of that business 2.0 world will actually keep you smarter and sharper as you get older. Amazing. Amazing. But this is what the world has learned in terms of our sciences. Well, why not we leverage the sciences, the neuroscience, the behavioral science, with the technology and put them together? Because sadly, most organizations, even like the one I work for, are still using essentially this to try to get engagement ratcheted up. Not going to happen. Again, let's go back to what happened at NASA. Nothing wrong with the data. The metadata was perfect. It was the means at which it was communicated. With Prysm, that goes away. I can be in the middle of the night thinking, oh, I got an idea. And I can go on my device and actually annotate that whiteboard. I don't have to take pictures of it. And remember, if I emailed it to everybody like we do now, meeting minutes, all that kind of stuff goes away. And we can all interact with that data in a spatial format. I have a book coming out next year. It's going to come out in the spring, and it's called Tethered. And it's about what I see as a massive, it's like a pandemic almost in our culture, not just here, but in Europe and around the globe, where people are so tethered to their electronic devices that they've lost that ability to connect face to face. I see people with pets and they are on their phones. I see them in the bathroom and they can't put it down. They can't put it down in restaurants, in the gym, nowhere. This is not going to solve problems. I'm sorry. It's not going to bring levels of innovation in your organization to the levels you need to advance against your competitor. But that's not what Prysm's about. Prysm is about taking technology that we need in our frenetic pace of information flow and leveraging the human brain. What goes on in those synapses and millions of neural junctions inside your head. And if you put those together, you've got something really, really awesome. So with that, I want to thank my friends at Prysm for having me here. And if your organization needs a little kickstart, a little motivational kick, give me a holler. I'm on LinkedIn. And if you want to copy a link, I'll gladly sign it for you, or it's on Barnes & Noble, and it's also on Amazon. But I enjoy the rest of the day. Ask them lots of questions. Dive into this, because I'm telling you, if you engage with this type of technology, but keeping the face-to-face, ratchet up that collaboration, get people out of the 1.0 and 2.0 rabbit hole, you'll see some really awesome stuff happen in your organizations. So thank you very much.